Yeah, so I'd like to talk about some of the restoration monitoring we've done with unmanned aircraft with a drone, and we've compared that into some on-the-ground measurements Tiffany Newman with Weyerhaeuser did. And so I guess I didn't have drone in my title, and I think the second talk is we didn't just not drones in that title either, but that's just what we were talking about. You know, I've called them unmanned aircraft. You know, drones kind of the colloquial name. I think my generation, UAV rolls off the tongue a bit better. If you're talking to someone from outside of North America, you might hear them called RPAs. The FAA, their official term is Unmanned Aircraft Systems, UAS. So that's the term I tend to use to follow their lead. But the point of calling those things is that nomenclature isn't really settled yet. And if you're trying to figure out, do a literature search, how has this been used in the kind of work I'm interested in, you probably have to include all these different terms in there to find out what it is. I mean, some people call them drones in their paper, some people call them UAS, UAV. You can see this particular paper, they're from Australia, so they call it an RPA, but they put in all those terms in there, just catch them all. It's a drone, UAS, UAV, they put them all in there just to get their bases covered. But to find papers you're interested in, you kind of have to use all those different names. And you'll see, we call them unmanned aircraft systems. That's the FAA term. We also see them called unmanned aerial systems or unmanned airborne systems. Nomenclature is just kind of all over the place for this, but kind of relatively new technology. But the reason that ODFW is using these things in the first place is, we're out there trying to manage fish and wildlife in their habitats, so we need to count things and measure things. And we're experimenting with these as anything that you can see from the air. Maybe you can get some counts and measurements on that for management purposes, but also using them to get some outreach and information purposes, taking videos and pictures for that. The main reason really why we're using them is for safety. We had a helicopter go down doing red surveys on the South Umpqua with some serious injuries, and it was just, at that time it was like, how else can we do this work? That's not going to put people in danger. My colleague Liz Brady at the Sea Corps project, where they put these random quadrats out in the estuaries, and some of the places are just, the mud is so sticky. They actually had to have, one year they had to have a hovercraft come and rescue somebody stuck in the mud, the tides coming in. So maybe UAS is some way to get people off those mud flats. We've got a wild fish sanctuary in the North Sanium that, we need to know what the fish are doing in there, but some section goes through Niagara Park. You can tell from the name it's not class 2. So being able to get people that actually can float that section and get counts of fish in there, it could be maybe potentially done a lot safer from the air. We can cover a pretty large area pretty quickly from the air. We've just got a quadcopter, but that can cover as much as 100 acres in a single flight, and it's got a stack of batteries. You can get a lot of measures, cover a lot of area that would take a long time to cover on the ground. And some of the results we get maybe actually be higher quality than what we're getting from traditional methods. This is a still from a video on Cow Creek off the South Umpqua, and those string-shook reds show up great on this, a lot better than we took video from a helicopter too. It's flying really fast and high and all shaky. And the guys say they can make measurements from the helicopter video, but it's a lot higher quality from the UAV. So I think people are really familiar with the kind of aerial pictures and photos that you get. Everyone's got their sunset on the beach in Hawaii on the Instagram from their drone and stuff like that. But and those kind of aerial perspectives are really great for sharing your work and for getting a different perspective on your project. But where it kind of gets more interesting is when you can align those photos, georeference them, and see how the change happens over time. Classify what's going on in those images. And the work I'm going to talk about is using, creating 3D models using photogrammetry that allows you to do measurements from the air. And I'm going to share a case study just kind of comparing some on-ground measurements with our from-the-air measurements and seeing how those matched up in a relatively small project just to kind of test it out. Before I do that, I'm just going to talk a little bit some of the other uses. We've done aerial photo points. You can put it up in the air and get the same perspective over time. Some habitat construction, whatever hatchery, or some pond construction, whatever hatcheries. We've used it to identify invasive species when doing some restoration work. So this is one of our newest wildlife areas, Gale Ackerman Wildlife Area near Salem, and this is a composite image, so it's about 700 megapixels covering the 42 acres, and you can zoom in anywhere on that, like that section, and get a pretty good level of detail. And those photos then allow you to identify the native wapato versus the invasive water primrose, and really helps the restoration people get in there and know where they need to do work. And you can see that with your naked eye, but we've also been experimenting with image classification, letting the computer do the work and letting it tell us where the native plants are and where they aren't. And Liz, my colleague I showed before, Liz, they've been doing this on the estuaries too, using that classification to tell them where eelgrass is, for example, and how that's changing from year to year. And with their on-the-ground methods, they would normally only go into an estuary every 5 years. They're on a rotating basis, so they can cover the whole Oregon coast. But being able to get here with a UAV and just fly really quickly and get this imagery fairly quickly compared to what they were doing on the ground, they can cover this area and now look at interannual change, where they were never getting that kind of temporal resolution before trying to do stuff with their traditional methods. But the case study I'm going to talk about is looking at how these could be used for implementation monitoring. And I think most people here are probably pretty familiar with that. I mean, it's something that the funding group wants to know what you actually did. Did it go the way you think it was supposed to, and what actually happened? And so I'm going to be talking about Mill Creek off the Flux River near Logston on the Oregon coast. It's one of our life cycle monitoring sites, and we had an OEB grant placed in nearly 700 logs in Mill Creek and its tributaries, over 11 kilometers treated. And this is a really interesting, great study. We've got a lot of cooperators on there with OEB, Mid-Coast Watershed Council, ODFW, Weyerhaeuser, the landowner in there, DQ is doing some work, a couple different groups from OSU are in there. We've got 2 master's projects out of that already. For the implementation monitoring, we started with this channel and we put a bunch of wood in there. For the implementation monitoring, just need to report where and how much and how that worked. And the traditional method that Tiffany and her Weyerhaeuser crews did was just to walk the stream, measure the wood, and that took about a crew of 2 to 4 people, 180 crew hours. And I did, for the pilot project, wanted to try out aerial photogrammetry and see what we get from that, where we fly a grid over a section of stream, use structure for motion processing that then allows you to build a 3D model of that area, and you can do counts and measures on your computer then. And so for this pilot study, just looked at 9 structures that we put in on 1 kilometer of stream. Use a medium-sized quadcopter that carries a variety of different sensors, and this is what the mission looks like. You just pre-program this in the computer, hit a button, and the quadcopter will fly back and forth along that grid, taking photos. And there's trade-offs in that kind of mission planning about how closer to the ground you are, the higher resolution images you can get. The higher up you are, less likely you are to run into trees, and the more ground you can cover. But in this area, our kind of standard habitat protocols, we measure to the 1/10 of a meter. The Weyerhaeuser crews were measuring to the nearest inch on the wood that they were looking at, and so we kind of set that 60 meters was enough to keep us above the trees, at least down in the valley, and it gave us enough ground sampling resolution to make comparable measurements. And this is what the flights would look like. Each push pin is a picture, so I think there's about 300 pictures for that particular flight, flying back and forth. You can see for this kilometer stream, we broke it into 2 flights, and the aircraft we got could easily do that whole section in 1 flight. But I just bring that up because there is still regulations that we need to follow. We need to keep our eye on the quadcopter at all times. We need to be able to see the aircraft, maintain visual line of sight, what the FAA calls it. And so we need to break it up, take flights. We can't fly all the way down here because the trees are blocking, we can't see it, so we just pack it up and do a couple of different flights. But just in general, these are the photos. These are comparison of 2 photos, before and after. There's wood in there now. Again, you can mosaic those photos to get a high resolution image across the entire study area. But so the photo's nice. We can make counts from that. We can see what happened. But where it gets a lot more interesting is when you take these hundreds of photos together and put them in the software that'll build a 3D model of the stream. And so that's using structure for motion, photogrammetry, multi-view stereo reconstruction, and just to kind of get really briefly how that works is that we're looking at we're flying up the stream, taking multiple photos. We're looking at any particular point from this vantage point, from this vantage point, from this vantage point. You know, kind of triangulating all these different points as we fly along. And the software can analyze that image and put all these points in there and tie them all together, tie these images together. And that allows you to go from a photo like this to a 3D model of your stream that you can then, you know, go through and make counts and images, counts and measurements on. And so you have that study stream there for you that you can then take that back on your computer, and you have your study stream on your computer. And making measurements then is easy as a couple of clicks, and you know that particular wood was 12.6 meters long. So just to get straight into the results of comparing, you know, this kind of measurement on the computer versus what the Weyerhaeuser crew did on the ground, we end up with a really similar, in the end, similar volume measurement for the whole area. In some places, actually, we counted more from the air. We could definitely see, I think there's in a big stack of wood, there's a chance to overlook some stuff when you're on the ground. But I have to bring up, there's some places where their view is obscured by overhanging vegetation. And in those cases, we got an incomplete count of the wood from the air, and we weren't able to make volume measurements. We could see, we could take pictures of that wood, but we couldn't, there wasn't enough tie points there to get that whole photogrammetry to reconstruct this section of stream underneath the wood, underneath the overhanging alders and things like that. So yes, this is from again 9 structures in 1 kilometer of stream. But we could compare some individual logs. This one's 265, this one's 360. So we can individually compare 84 logs that they compared. So the previous, this is kind of aggregate total volume measurements. We could also compare individual logs. 84 logs could be individually identified from the air and matched up with the ground measurements. And we see a good relationship there. There's no indication of bias for our length measurements. And similarly with width, there's a more spread there because we're taking smaller measurements relative to our ground sampling resolution. But again, there's no indication of bias in either length or width measurements. And so it seems like that if you can see it from the air, you can easily measure it. And I guess point there are definitely places where we couldn't see things from the air. Further along, the stream comes through here, and there's a couple, wood placement structures underneath the alders here. We'll zoom in, and you can see some wood in there. But we do have, this is the single orthomosaic image. We do have images from multiple different angles that you are able to still kind of peek through and see what the wood is. And in this case, the ground count had 20 logs in this structure. I was able to count 18, which I'm pretty happy with the amount of cover there is there. But just another structure that was obscured by alders when you're looking at using native photography, looking straight down, but taking some oblique pictures allows us to kind of see into some of these structures. And so putting that in a mix into the photogrammetry might help as well. So just to kind of recap for that pilot study, where it works, it seemed like we're providing comparable information. So if we just wanted to get a count and measure of wood, if you can see it from the air, you can probably measure it. But the thing is that that UAS imagery, as we saw, we're getting more than just kind of measure. We're getting a full 3D model of the stream. And so this is just kind of the data we get from our traditional methods. The Weyerhaeuser crew, they gave me a geographic location and a table of the wood in there. So we know that at point 1, there's this bunch of wood. And at point 2, there's another table full of wood measurements. And that kind of gives us a good instance. Generally in that location, there's some wood there. But compare that to the 3D model, then we know the bearing range aspect of every single piece of wood in there. And that's going to be, I think, really interesting to see how structures change over time and how the stream width changes and things like that. And this is also kind of encasing our study area in amber. So this is what it looked like at that point in time in February 2016 or 2017, after the wood was put in there. And say 10 years ago, 10 years from now, when we're making our restoration effectiveness monitoring conclusions, and we realize that metric X, if only we would have been measuring that. But we didn't, back when we did our full suite of habitat surveys and things like that when it was before and after, but we didn't measure metric X. Maybe with this 3D model of the stream, we can go back there and make those measurements 10 years from now. that we have an idea of what it looked like back at that time, more than just some links in a database table. So in the end, we didn't have any injuries with either method. We're talking about when maybe UAS can be safer. We did have a guy get injured crawling over one of these log jams doing flying ground surveys later in the year. But it does look like, oops, it's going the wrong way. Here we go. It does look like it was more efficient in this case. I was able to fly over all the structures. Particularly this year in 2018, I flew over pretty much all the structures in less than a week. Whereas it took over 180 crew hours to cover those structures from the ground. But again, looking at it from the air, I'm not able to make countermeasures on all these structures. And really in Mill Creek, where we've got some areas where you can see the structures, some areas you can't, probably a hybrid approach might be where you fly the stream, count what you can from the air, and send in a ground crew to follow up afterwards. There are going to be different situations depending on your stream. If it's a much larger stream or you're in an estuary someplace where you have good open views, you could maybe do it all from the air. I can imagine smaller streams where you can't do hardly anything from the air. But, I mean, the fact that you can't see these structures from the air, that's data in itself. You know what kind of cover there is. There's a lot of information you can get even if you can't necessarily see these structures. Definitely, I think the data we're getting from the air is more data rich. Those 3D models give you a lot more information. Though it does not discount the work you can do on the ground, relabeling logs or the physical work. So in the end, I think if you can see it from the air, we found that in our study situation, and this isn't necessarily something new. I think there has been work showing how the accuracy of measurements from using photogrammetry and things like that. But a lot of the published work I've seen is like for stockpiles and quarries, kind of industrial work. I hadn't seen it before for measuring pieces of wood on the ground like this, and so I wanted to just kind of check and see if that's actually possible. It provided us with great spatial information, but we did have, regulations do limit us somewhat in the efficiency. I think it's still more efficient than some of the ground-to-ground work. And I just wanted, these images are coming from our Mill Creek Effectiveness Monitoring Project, where we put wood in there. And this is, as I mentioned, one of our life cycle monitoring sites where we've been monitoring since 1998. So we have fish in, fish out data almost 20 years pre-restoration. And again, we're cooperating with a lot of different people in there to look at what's going on. And with that, I think we're actually taking questions afterwards. So I'll see you then.